Okay, welcome to EPLS 7373, Qualitative Methods and Research, final class presentation. Students will present either individually or in groups their semester-long project, which was qualitative, involved interviewing a minimum of 3 individuals related to the student's individual research interests and subject areas of study. And the students conducted the mini study over the semester and collected data and analyzed data and created a poster related to their individual studies. So what we're about to see is a poster presentation via Zoom because we're still in the time of COVID. And we have 11 posters from students who are from a variety of programs across the University of Iowa. So without further ado, we will go right into the poster presentations.
Hi, this is Carly Armour and Celine Fender, and our mini-study is entitled The Exploration of Former University of Iowa Student Athletes' Experience in Their Preparation for Life After Athletics. Our study used a phenomenological framework to explore former University of Iowa student athletes' shift out of collegiate life into the real world, and how the University of Iowa aided in their transition. The research questions included, what do former student athletes at Iowa wish they did differently to prepare for their transition out of collegiate athletics? And how did the University of Iowa aid in their transition? For this study, we interviewed 3 former University of Iowa student athletes regarding their preparation and transition into life after athletics.
For a literature review session, when we combed through the literature, some of the common threads we found around this topic were loss of salient identities in student athletes, the difficulty transitioning out of collegiate athletics, difficulty constructing a new identity, and the need to restructure their time.
A lot of our findings parallel to what was discovered in the literature review. One of the most common findings between our study and the literature we reviewed is that our student athletes experience identity crises when transitioning out of their senior year, despite whether they took advantage of courses and workshops meant to ease the experience. Another finding through our data analysis is that privilege and race play a role in the experience, expectations, and the support student athletes received. One participant was a white male, second participant was a white female, and the third participant was a black male. A final finding through the analysis is that participants had mixed feelings on whether the University of Iowa athletic resources significantly aided in their transition out of collegiate life.
Now for the discussion limitation session, a major issue that came up was that a participant dropped out of the study right before the interview stage. This did not have a big effect on the overall study, but it did take away from the intention of investigating the experiences between 2 high revenue and 2 low revenue generating sports, as well as having a balance of 2 female and 2 male participants. The participant who dropped out of the study was a previous female field hockey student athlete. So this was unfortunate. Other limitations include the fact that this was a limited semester-long project, meaning there was a limited time frame to conduct this study. In order to determine a phenomenon, further research is needed through interviewing more participants. This will give us a better look at the larger picture. Additionally, during the data analysis stage of the study, further questions centering around privilege and race were discovered and noted for further investigation. If you are interested in learning more about this study, you may use the QR code provided on the poster. We hope that you enjoyed this very brief overview of the mini-study, and we look forward to sharing more in the future. Thank you for tuning in.
All right, should we keep on rolling then?
Yep, thanks to Carly and Celine, and now we're going to move on to Cole.
Okay. Can I get share screen privileges? Thank you. Still says it's disabled. Okay. There we go. Okay, can y'all see that? Okay. So hello, my name is Cole Dennison. My project was evaluating conceptual mapping and its uses in understanding how those who engage in basic needs work, specifically in college pantries, actually think about their roles in supporting students who are food insecure. So during my literature review, I found that there was actually not a lot when it comes to published literature regarding pantries and how pantries actually impact the campus community. Those that did exist were largely descriptive in nature, so just very surface level statistics, and none that really delved into trying to understand how those who are engaging in the work really think about the campus pantry's role. So the purpose of the study was really threefold. So I take a PAR lens, participant action research lens, in that I actively try to involve the focus of the study, the members of the focus group in the actual research process. And that does a couple of things. One, it helps me check my own biases with what they're thinking about and making sure that their voice actually comes through the research. It also helps mitigate the power dynamics that exist between being a researcher and the actual participants in the study. So part of this was to help those involved in the daily running of a pantry think a little bit deeper about how they're involving themselves in the pantry functioning and how the pantry services students. I also wanted to evaluate concept mapping and try to understand if this is a useful tool going forward to better understand how students are thinking about how the pantry is serving them. And then I also wanted to help contribute to the understanding of how pantries really work to service their clients, especially on the college campus. So the methods I used was actually largely introduced by a previous study, Rapond et al. In 2017. Their study involved 28 individuals representing community colleges, universities, master's level pantries, across the state of Michigan. And while their study and approach was very unique, there were a number of shortfalls within the study that led to a significant amount of attrition. So a lot of their participants ended up having to drop out of the study entirely. A lot of the activities were not able to complete. So the data that resulted from that study is actually very limited in scope and generalizability. So my study is going to involved 3 individuals, each of whom are involved in the daily running of the campus pantry. And they went through 3 separate activities related to conceptual mapping. The first is a listing activity, in which I told them basically to word vomit. Think of all the things, all the ways that the pantry services its clients, and just put them all on, I say a paper, but it was actually a Qualtrics list. And that generated over 120 responses. Now, what I did with those 120 responses is I worked directly with one of the participant researchers to make a much smaller parsimonious list. So we ended up making a list of about 60 individual statements. The statements themselves are ideally representative of a single concept or a theme. The second activity was a Likert scale. So now that we've generated these this list of 60 statements, individualized statements, I asked the participants to rate those statements on 3 separate scales. The first scale was how important those statements or that theme is to the pantry's mission. The second is what effect do those services, what impact do they have on student success, and how difficult those services are to accomplish or implement. In addition to that, I also had focus groups after every activity, and the focus groups played several different roles. The first was triangulation. It allowed me to really kind of get in to what they were saying when they were going through these activities. It also allowed me to check how these participants were actually engaging with the activities themselves as well. So I could check to see if this was really a useful methodological tool in understanding where they were coming from. So once the list was actually generated, I actually sent it out to the participants. I made sure to check with them to make sure that these statements really captured what they were trying to say. We went through the Likert scale together, and I had a focus group after each activity, with the exception of the second one. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then we basically talked through what their experiences were as they were going through the activities. What were they thinking about? How were they engaging with the activity? What did they find frustrating? What did they find great and very, very useful? And the idea is to really kind of identify and hone in some of the obstacles that may be in place prior to rolling this out to a larger group. So the results, again, here are the 60 individualized statements that are my participants generated. Some are more apparent, like it provides nutritious food. Yes, that's what a pantry does. Others are a little bit more abstract, like physical and mental health, like values. There were a lot of value statements. Whether or not this aligns with the university's mission and values, whether or not the pantry acts as a symbol of hope. So some very, very practical, some very abstract. And so moving on to the results from activity 2, what I began to see is some very, very strong themes started to emerge from both the focus groups and from the actual data from the different activities. So those statements that were most salient to the pantry's mission were it provides nutritious food, it supports clients' physical health, it supports clients' mental health, and it helps educate the campus community about the impact of food insecurity among the college student population. All of those were rated 5 by all 3 respondents with 0 variance. I mean, which, yeah, logically follows. The least important were rated 3. So this was a scale, again, from 1 to 5. So 3 would have been like right in the middle with 0 variance. And it aligns with and supports the university's missions and values. It provides items for client sexual health, information about sexual health, and then symbol of institutional values and hope. These were the 3 main abstracts. So mission and values, the values statements seem to be the least important according to my participants. And I'll also get into that a little bit too. Most impactful, it helps clients save money. Again, very, very practical. It allows clients to support themselves. It supports clients' mental and physical health. You see those pop up again. And it provides access to nutritious food. So those statements, the nutritious food, physical health, mental health, consistently came up as in my respondents' view as very integral and very important to how the pantry actually services its clients. Now, as far as how difficult these things are to implement, it provides culturally aware services they thought was extremely difficult. And that also came up in the focus groups as well. Striving to provide easily accessible hours. That's related to the model that the pantry is set up. It is a student-run, student overseen service. And the issue with having students is that students are students first, and they should be students first. So when you're trying to provide a reliable access to food around with a staff primarily of students, hours can get a little wonky. It's hard to provide consistent hours. And lastly, it provides kitchen items, was also ranked as being most difficult. And if you think about it, a lot of our dorm rooms, a lot of our residential areas, designated residential areas, don't have cooking areas, because the idea is that students go to the local market to buy their food. But that doesn't work if you don't have money to buy the food. Some of the easiest things, important, and there was a little bit of variance with these. It provides important services without screening or demonstration of financial need. So all you need is to basically walk in and prove that you're either a faculty member or a student with your little ID. So you sign in usually with your ID or your ID number. And that's it. That's all you need. They don't ask questions they don't try to make you prove that you need this service. And that was also came up as one of the most important things that they do. And again, physical health pops up. Save money, alleviates client stress. Client stress also somewhat relates to mental health as well. So some feature quotes that really came up that really resonated throughout the study is that they felt that this particular approach really helped them dig deeper and think critically about the work that they do and engage in. The ranking activity specifically almost forced them to think about, okay, what is the most important things that we do? And what is the least important things that we do? And how do we really think about how we service our clientele moving forward? There were some questions regarding the methodology and the activities themselves. It's really hard. It's much easier to rank and rate the statements and ideas that you come up with. It is much harder to do that for someone else's ideas. And that is something that all three respondents actually mentioned throughout our focus groups, is how difficult it was to rank other statements. Some even had very, very strong reactions to some of the statements developed by the other respondents, to the point where they didn't even want to rank them. They didn't even want to engage those into the activity because they felt that it didn't really resonate with how they were thinking about how the pantry services its clients. And finally, the third activity was the thematic grouping. So what I did is I asked the participants, once they developed this 60 statement list, to try to organize them into different groups based on how they were related to each other. I tried to make it as vague as possible because I didn't want to prompt them into specific groups. So Barbara, who has been, and these are pseudonyms, by the way, who has been involved with the pantry for about 4 semesters, created 11 separate groupings. Things such as outreach and awareness, support, things that you do for immediate relief when clients are in crisis, versus what are some of the more abstract things like sense of belonging. And each of these numbers corresponds with a different statement up here. Jane and Franny had both been at the pantry for about 2 years, or excuse me, not 2 years, 2 semesters, so about a full academic year. And one of the things I noticed, and I'm not sure if that's just with this particular group and whether or not this pattern will play out if I roll this out to a larger group, is Barbara actually had a lot more groupings than Jane or Franny. And I'm wondering if that is if that is because the longer you are engaged in this work, the more nuanced your concept and understanding of how a pantry services its clientele becomes. Again, this is something to consider in future research, and I do want to roll this out to a larger group. And then you have Franny down here, who's one of the newer members of the pantry executive team. Was very, I guess, explicit. So direct support, indirect support, services, growth, data, and relationship values. So Some of the things that came up in our discussions, which we've already mentioned, the statements, it provides access to nutritious food, it supports clients' physical health, it supports clients' mental health, consistently came up both in the focus groups as well as the organizational activities. The different themes that came out during my coding was respondents had difficulty sorting statements, especially if those statements weren't their own. The respondents said that they were overwhelmed by the sheer amount of statements that were generated. Even when we parsed them down to about 60 statements, it was still an overwhelming amount of data. And then there was some overlap. The way we think about specific concepts, it's relational, and it's not as easy to put them into boxes. And our respondents, or my respondents, had difficulty kind of parsing out, especially if those thematic statements seemed very, very similar to each other. They were unsure of whether or not they should be put in the same group together. Are they, like, how separate they are? And I think Franny's statement really kind of shows that. Actually, it was respondent B's. So right here, they talk about sense of community and how there was a sense of campus community. So how related are those concepts? How separate are those concepts? And if they are separate, do I put them in separate categories? So that's something that also came up pretty frequently. So conclusions. After going through this process and speaking with my respondents and having multiple focus groups, I do think that this method shows potential going forward. I do think that the thematic categories that emerged and the statements that were rated with very little variance kind of show that there is an overall concept or a general way that those who are engaging in this work are thinking about how the pantry services its clients. And I'm very curious to see if that pattern continues once I roll this out to a much larger group. Limitations for future studies. Due to time constraints, it was very hard to organize Zoom meetings, especially 3 separate Zoom meetings. In fact, due to time constraints and due to some of the issues that came up with scheduling, we were only able to do 2 Zoom meetings, and our last one ended up getting extended a little bit so I could still get the data from the Likert activity. The statement generation from 3 respondents, it was over 100, and it took so long, way more than I expected, to really parse those down to 60. I can only imagine what sort of statements, the number of statements that are going to be generated by 10 plus respondents. So going forward, I really need to make sure to allot more time for that. But that also means that taking more time to parse those statements also means that I'm going to have a lot long gap between activities, which may affect how our respondents engage in those activities. And then I just have to be more mindful of the time in which I'm implementing them, implementing this study. Since my respondents are students, I am somewhat hindered by the academic schedule. So one of the things I found is probably shouldn't do a study close to exam time. It's really, really hard to schedule students when it's close to major projects and major exams. So I'm thinking about doing this much earlier in the semester. So that's pretty much it. Are there any questions?
I think we're gonna do questions toward the end so that we can get through all the ones first. Thank you, Cole. That was a really interesting study. And I'm also excited to kind of hear about where it goes in the future as we keep going on in future semesters. And now over to Logan.
Sorry, when I go full screen, my computer freaks out and hides my unmute button. So now hopefully you can hear me. Can you see? Yes, you can see this. So I was glad to follow Cole both because his presentation was great, and I love seeing posters that have lots of stuff on them because I also put lots of stuff on mine. You know, we all get great advice of like, don't bog your poster down in words and that stuff. But I rejected that advice because I had a lot of quotes that I liked. So I jammed as many in there as I see Leslie shaking her head. I'm sorry. But yeah, also, I just want to give everyone a warning. About 20 feet behind this window, they're building a house. So if you hear what sounds like explosions or dump trucks just going crazy, it's because that's what's going on. So yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to my chat. Today, I'll be talking a bit about the study I did looking at Catholic school teachers' experiences with conversations about controversial issues in the classroom. My interest in this kind of emerges from a lot of political and kind of philosophical theory about the role schools play in a healthy democracy. This whole idea that schools are where kids become socialized as citizens, kind of learn about the importance of knowing about politics, participating in politics, voting, holding politicians accountable, all these sorts of very important things. There's, and probably a lot of you could guess this just based on how politics are going in the world right now, but on a lot of measures, schools aren't doing as well as they could in this regard. Students' knowledge about politics, just like how politics works, the structure of government, all of those things, students' knowledge of that is pretty low across the country. And there's, like a lot of things, there's some pretty glaring racial gaps in who gets taught what and how well. And there's been a general trend across, it depends who you talk to, but over the last several decades, kind of de-emphasizing the more civic and moral missions of schools and focusing more on economic outcomes and how good of a job can we shove these kids into. And there's plenty of research out there on how to do this better. A lot of it emphasizes the need to make it more engaging for kids. Right now, most states require just one semester of civics education to graduate high school. And you know, teachers have a lot of stuff to jam into that semester. And usually the best way to jam a lot of content into it is to just lecture all the time. And doing that, you cover a lot of stuff, but you don't necessarily make it very interesting. And one of the most, the way I think that's most interesting, and the research really shows that it works when it's done to make politics and civic education more engaging, is to engage students in, you can call it different things, hot button topics, discussions of controversial issues, all those sorts of things. Engaging students in kind of in-depth conversations about things that are going on right now, not just, you know, what are the three branches of government and how do they balance each other out? Like, that's important to know, but it's not going to get any kids really excited. And when it comes to these controversial conversations, there's, I would call it inconsistent or mixed evidence about how often they're used. There's plenty to show that when they're used, it's really effective. But studies looking at how often they're used are usually very focused on particular places. Obviously, they can say, you know, this California school district, 70% of the kids said they got these sorts of discussions. But in this Omaha school district, only 30 did. And it's hard, you know, it's very piecemeal. And there's no kind of big overview. So that's kind of the motivation behind this. The reason I wanted to focus on Catholic schools is, one, there's basically no research on how these go on in Catholic schools. And I think Catholic schools represent a really interesting intersection politically right now. I don't know how much you guys know about Catholic social teaching, but there's a big emphasis on what they call the right to life, which usually focuses right now a lot on anti-abortion rights advocacy. But if you talk to some people, they'll also talk about how right to life includes right to healthcare, right to support for the poor, all these sorts of more democratic leading things. So Catholics are really at this interesting intersection where some of their central teachings don't put them solidly in one party or the other. So there's a lot of like, who do we vote for? How do we suss this out? And there's also this idea that, Catholic schools are private so that they have more leeway to kind of engage in these controversial issues because of their private nature. They're not going to get as much pushback from the public for kind of indoctrination-y reasons. But there's also, on the other hand, there's a room for more pushback because in Catholic schools, there's a right answer in theory to a lot of these moral questions in a way that there's not in public schools. So I wanted to just kind of talk to some teachers and figure out, what do they think about controversial conversations? Do they see it as valuable? Do they see it as not valuable? And how has it gone when they've dealt with these? So I talked to three, they might be offended by this term, but I'd call them pretty senior Catholic educators. They all had pretty storied careers. One was currently a principal of a Catholic elementary school, previously had been a professor in a teacher prep program. Before that, had taught elementary school for a number of years. Another one, he had the most all over the place career. He had spent most of his career teaching secondary government, so at the high school level, and then had become an elementary school principal of a Catholic school, and then just last year had left the Catholic school system over some tensions he had with the church. And then the last one, the oldest guy, had been teaching religion at the high school level basically for 40 years. He taught PE 1 year right out of college and then switched to religion and has done that since. And I used the kind of, I'll see if I can pronounce this, phenomenological perspective to try to get at kind of what is the essence of these teachers' experiences, trying not to project my own theories or ideas onto what they say, but just kind of get at the core of what they're describing. So, and I won't read every single quote off here, even though I think they're all great. So I sorted, it took, here's everything they said, typed it up. That took what seemed like 3 weeks. And then went through it and pulled out some of the main themes that all of them touched on. So the first kind of big thing, they all pretty quickly got on board with the idea that, or expressed the idea that engaging in controversial discussions in the classroom is very valuable. They had a lot of different reasons they thought it was useful. It helps develop critical thinking, which they think is really important, and probably a lot of us agree is important for all sorts of reasons. They talked about it as a form of self-discovery for students. I thought there was a really interesting example. The teacher was describing a student who came from a pretty conservative family and didn't feel comfortable like trying out political ideas with the family that might not align with what they think. And the teacher felt that his classroom kind of provided a space for the student to experiment with their identity and just try out ideas and kind of see how people respond to it, as a way of, students figuring themselves out both personally and politically. And then the idea I really liked is this one here, that it's valuable because it helps develop moral citizens, and this idea that, a good citizen isn't just one who knows how to vote to make their interests advance and be better, but one that kind of grounds their political decision-making in these really well thought out ideals of right and wrong and what's good for, the community and the country, not just what's best for themselves. And there's a lot of, moving on to the next theme here, there's a lot of research on teachers' fears about engaging in these sorts of conversations, that they're worried they're going to get pushback from the principal, from teacher, or from parents, from the public. And while most of these teachers didn't describe many instances of getting pushback from parents, they had a weird way of talking about how their school leaders dealt with it. So when they would all say like, yeah, my principals have generally supported me in my desire to talk about these conversations. But then when they would go on to describe what that support looked like, it was basically just approval, saying like, yeah, do whatever, don't get us in trouble, but it's fine. There wasn't much in the way of what I would call support, kind of providing, whether it's emotional support or encouragement or training on how to deal with these sorts of conversations. Because it really is, when you think about it, it's a unique skill that's a little different than just being able to teach, here are the 3 branches and here's how they balance each other out. They all said they had no training in how to do this, had no encouragement from leaders. When they sought support from leaders, they got it, but it was pretty passive. No real like pushing them to think critically about it or how they might maximize its value. But all 3 of them chose to embrace the use of controversy anyway. They said, this is what the job is. I feel like I'd be failing my students if I didn't do this. And a few of them had some descriptions of their own education growing up and really feeling like the teachers who avoided these sorts of conversations were not good and not doing their job. So all of them pretty consciously wanted to avoid that and do better than what they had to deal with. But despite seeing a lot of value in these conversations, all 3 of them provided examples of times when they had avoided the conversations anyway. And I thought that was interesting. And usually it was in the context of just like, oh, this is too hot button, or this is too controversial, and I don't want people to be yelling or getting mad in my classroom. So that was really, you might not call that a strategy for managing conversation. It's more of a strategy for avoiding it. But that was one all the teachers talked about. And 2 other big strategies was just maintaining or establishing and maintaining a respectful climate in the classroom, trying to build relationships with people and make everyone feel comfortable sharing with the teacher, but also sharing with others, that they're not just going to be made fun of for expressing a half-thought idea or expressing a controversial idea. They all talked about pretty consciously trying to develop that early on each year and each semester. And they also talked about the need to relate issues to what students are dealing with. And this was especially common with people that were working with elementary schoolers. In one case, the principal of an elementary school described how the district had sent somebody into the school to talk about abortion and how bad it was. And the principal was very uncomfortable with that, both because she kind of disagreed with the policy side of it, but also because it's weird to be talking to like, I don't know, how old are elementary schoolers, 8, 9-year-olds, and being like, well, the Democrats want to kill babies. And she's just like, she was pretty explicit. Like, that's not appropriate issue to talk to elementary schoolers about. So she shut that down pretty quickly and pulled that person out of her classrooms and had some words with the district that had sent them in. But she talked about how at the next in-service day, she had a big organized effort to help the teachers think through, okay, right to life is a Catholic issue that we all care about. How do we connect this to something the elementary schoolers are going to understand and make sense of in their life? And what they came up with, they had lots of examples of bullying in their school. And they emphasized that as a right to life issue, that, everyone deserves to feel respect and to feel part of a community, and bullying really tears that apart. So the teachers kind of going forward were told to try to reframe things in that context rather than focusing on this very adult issue of abortion politics. And the last two themes I'll touch on just kind of quick here. They don't have fancy sub-themes like the others, but all three teachers talked about experiencing tensions between their own beliefs and the beliefs of the church, or the practices of the church in some cases. And they, two of the three, I think, talked about how earlier in their career, it was a lot easier to just kind of spout the church line on all these issues. But as they've gotten more mature and have seen things as more gray and less black and white, they had, issues with how do I teach kids that the church says same-sex marriage is not okay, when I very much feel like it is, and it's an important social justice issue, those sorts of things. And none of them really had an answer to how to resolve that tension, except the one who left Catholic schools altogether, which I guess resolved the tension, but it doesn't seem like a sustainable solution for Catholic schools. And then this last thing is just that they all pointed out that it's getting harder to talk about these things. And this was usually framed explicitly in terms of President Trump, that his brand of politics and heightened partisanship and all those things have made these conversations, especially with a lack of training, even harder to engage in. And I thought this quote, just who wants to teach government right now? It's like, seriously, it's become so toxic. Who wants to be in that? It's really a minefield. So these were all teachers that saw these conversations as very valuable, had extensive experience engaging in them, but still didn't do it sometimes, consciously avoided it, and felt that it was getting harder and harder to do. And another thing I didn't put on the poster, though, is that they all felt like other teachers, and especially younger teachers, don't do this enough. And they all, they tried not to put the blame on the teachers, but on, the systems and the schools. The schools aren't encouraging it. The teacher prep programs aren't training them how to do it or emphasizing that it's important. And they all kind of had a dystopian view that, in a few years, it's just going to be impossible to have these conversations, and we're going to miss out on this really important learning that students are doing. So I think the big takeaway, besides just kind of understanding these different themes and events that kind of shaped teachers' understandings, the big takeaway, if you want to connect it to policies in the way a lot of us probably do, is that if we see this as important, the ability to help kids gain practice in talking civilly about controversial issues, maybe we should emphasize that in teacher training programs and help teachers figure out how to engage in those conversations, because it's not easy, and it can be tough, and it's only going to get tougher. So yeah, that's a whirlwind journey through the three conversations I had with these teachers. Thanks.
It's not loading. Okay, I'm gonna pull up mine. Let's see.
Thanks, Logan.
Okay, can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay.
We can't hear you, Rebecca. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's perfect.
I'm gonna not use the headphones. But anyway, as Leslie knows, I had some issues with recruitment, so this actual project is still a little bit ongoing. I'm missing one of my interviews. Turns out that women in rural veterinary practice can be hard to nail down. So this was just a general qualitative study, or basic qualitative study, aimed at just understanding women in veterinary practice experience, how they perceive their work, and kind of some challenges and barriers that face them specifically in the field. And just a little bit of an introduction. So this is actually part of my thesis work. So this has been a fun project to get onto. But in the 60s, less than 5% of women actually occupied seats in veterinary college. And today it's over 80% of women are graduating from vet school. So there's been a huge rapid feminization of the field. Yet there is still this perceived shortage of veterinarians that are going into rural veterinary practice. And so there's this little chart that I found here that kind of illustrates the gap a little bit. So you can see percentage of men in food animal exclusive. Sorry, I'm by the lake and there is a boat that is driving by. But anyways, so there is way more men in food animal predominant medicine, which makes up a lot of rural veterinary medicine. And even in mixed practice, there's still a little bit of a lead. And so this study was just aimed at trying to gauge why there's this gap and what's going on as far as barriers that might be presenting themselves to women entering the field. And there's, in some of the literature, which there's not a lot, there's this stigma that surrounds women entering agriculture. Just, are they strong enough? Are they able to deal with the kind of stresses that agriculture brings? And it was interesting, as I found in my 2 interviews, the women did not really like this term gender challenge. They thought of it more of like a personality issue. So like, if you're not willing to stand up for yourself and communicate your needs, then you are going to get basically trampled on by your clients and your bosses. So it was interesting that they really didn't like to call it a gender challenge. However, there is this very obvious disconnect in like men versus women in the field. So the themes that kind of came up after coding were like confidence. So the 2 vets really talked about how confidence played a role. They perceived confidence as a huge factor in your ability to succeed in the field. Communication was another one. The women felt like if you can communicate your needs and work with your clients, and understanding that veterinary medicine is like so much of a person, you have to have so many people skills to be in the field. You're working with people almost more than you're working with animals some of the time. That communication is key, and that change, this idea of change, perception of change in the field is very clear, that women are seeing all these changes happening, whether it's more women are entering rural veterinary practice, or that like this digital age has come in and kind of transformed the field. So there's those 3 kind of perceptions that are going on within the practice. And they're like, as far as the challenges and barriers, there were challenges and barriers within those 3 themes as well. Like if you can't communicate, then you're going to have, those are challenges. But challenges specific to women, both of the vets that I talked to said, anything a man can do in this field, we can do. I feel like there's not really much of a challenge that's just specific to women. However, there were some issues with like child rearing. So they would say these things and then they would be like, oh, well, actually, I guess if I'm raising my kids in this field, I do have a little bit of a challenge that maybe men wouldn't face with having to, like, it depends on if you're the primary parent in the relationship. So yeah, the women that I interviewed were currently working in rural veterinary practice. They were from the Midwest generally, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the one I'll be interviewing is from Nebraska. They were board certified, obviously, because they're currently in practice. And yeah, so it's interesting. It's still ongoing currently, but these were the main themes I was able to draw from my completed interviews and some of the conclusions I found as well. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. And we'll move over to Jeff, Jihong, and Shinji. And I believe I'm going to share this with you all. So give me just a second.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. So, hi everyone. Our team is composed by Jeff, me, and Jihong. So our topic is international student civic participation in the United States. A little bit background, because the number of international students has been increasing the last 10 years. Actually, last year, for the first time, we experienced a reduction of the total number of international students in the United States because of COVID and probably some political climate. However, at least last 10 decades, it kept going up. However, little is known how international students may perceive political activities like civic engagement, especially in the host country, United States. So it's the reason we examine how our international students conceptualize the political participation and democracy in the United States. And as a method, we conceptualize this study as a case study of international students in a public university at Midwestern states. And in this study, yes, we focus on international students, and we recruited 3 international students whose backgrounds are a little bit diverse. And then we base our theoretical frame, we base our study on the multiple theoretical framework: critical theory, critical race theory, cultural capital, engaged scholars, and the typology of civic engagement.
Yes, as for the results, there are 5 aspects we found which relate to international students' dilemma. The first one is political participation. We found that all 3 interviewees think the absence of the right to vote discourage international students to join the political activities. They also believe they are outsiders in the United States in some aspects. Second, about the protest, we found that the relevance to political events is also an important factor of political participation. If it's related to their life or group, international students are willing to go protest. However, if they believe this issue is irrelevant, they may not have motivation to join the political events. The third point is international students may take different actions with different ways, which may depend on their political experience and their knowledge. The fourth point is we found the academic burden plays a role in international students' civic engagement. The last point is we found that their prior experience with protest in their home country and the safety issue in the United States will also affect their political activities.
We also found that language was not a barrier that prevent their political participation, which is very interesting. For implication, we found that not all international students or students of color agree that there's a connection between Black and white matters and their own situation. Therefore, the media and the leader of the protest need to expand the goal and the purpose of social movements to not only advocate the rights of Black people and the Black-white binary, but to include all oppressed people and push for the change of systemic and structural racism. We also found that protest may not be a way that international students prefer, so it might be helpful to explore and develop some channels besides protests and election that lead to social changes, so international students can contribute to them. Some of these channels include campus involvement, writing to representatives, explaining some misunderstanding toward foreign countries to make students. It is also need to establish some platforms which empower the minority and underrepresented groups, so international students are not shown away from expressing their voices. Lastly, we have to build connection between traditionally defined academic work and social issues, so that students who are on their pursuits toward becoming a scholar will recognize that they can contribute to social movement too. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff Jiahong and Shinji. I think we can go with one more before we take a break. So next up is Heine and Sean.
Yep, I'll go ahead and take the sharing privileges for this one.
Great, you should be able to.
All right, thumbs up if you can see that. All right, thank you. Just always want to be sure. Okay, let me just move this here. Okay, my name is Sean Newman, and Heine Diaz was my co-writer for this mini study. Ours was it's called Teaching Improvisation to Student Musicians in the Middle, High, and University Level Instrumental Jazz Ensemble, a comparative case study. So kind of the introduction behind doing this study is both Heine and I have unique backgrounds. Heine has a master's degree in jazz studies. I was in jazz band 12 years ago. It's been a very long time for me, but I'm always interested in music, teaching approaches, and just approaches to ensemble directing in the realm of music education, given that we're both music education majors. And the kind of the short introduction is that there are jazz bands that are available to children and adults in middle schools, high schools, colleges, and universities across the United States. Typically, jazz bands are started in middle school. People that start, or students rather, that start in band typically start around 4th or 5th grade or so. But usually we don't see them joining jazz band until middle school when it's offered to them, usually as an extracurricular activity. Certainly in a lot of cases, it can be offered as a curricular ensemble that they can take during the school day. But you usually see that in the high school setting, and it depends on funding for those programs. So sometimes there are multiple jazz bands within a school. So you might have a school that's really well funded, maybe has a little bit more funds for the fine arts department or the music department, and they may have multiple jazz bands, lab jazz bands, they're sometimes called. So you might have jazz band, a lab jazz band 1 or lab band 2, that kind of thing. And sometimes they're categorized by the audition process. And so they're kind of ranked in maybe that order, or they're just kind of randomized. It really depends on the school district, and kind of what is involved in the decision-making process of the directors in charge of those programs. So we decided to look a little bit at the literature behind not just jazz bands in general, but improvisation. And so we always think of the word improv. You know, if you hear the word improv just in passing, you might think it's like an improv comic, right? But in music, especially in jazz, improvisation is something that's really, really vital to the jazz band and the genres that are involved in a jazz band, or in, as we call it, a instrumental jazz ensemble, or IJE. So we looked a little bit through the literature to make sure that we were defining this in a really well-mannered way, to see what we could come up with in terms of kind of exploring this area, and to see what issues may arise and where that would guide our study. So we have defined improvisation as a spontaneous creation of musical work at the moment of performance. This is from a study, Nettle et al. In 2001. And this musical skill is not only something that students use in their jazz ensembles, but it's an actual music learning standard by the National Association for Music Education, or NAFME. This is the premier professional development organization for music educators across the country. And they last updated their music standards 6 years ago in 2014, and continue to make it a skill set that students use not only in the jazz band, but through general music courses or classes and courses, and choirs, jazz choirs, you see it a lot. We decided to stick strictly with instrumental jazz ensembles. Heine and I are actually both piano players, and Heine is a fabulous jazz pianist, I might add. So this was really fun to work with him and learn from him about some of these different approaches here. So we kind of went a little bit further and defined what kind of improvisation we're talking about, or what is improvisation in jazz. We've heard it in general music settings, we've heard it in choral settings. Where does it fall into the category of specifically instrumental jazz ensembles? So we looked through a study from Brumbach of this year, it's very recent, and he defined these two broad categories of teaching approaches towards jazz music that are used to instill improvisation in student musicians rather. And so there are two of them. And the first one was called a theory-based approach. And it centers on the development of improv through different harmonic and fundamental concepts of music. So such as like the choice of notes that they choose to approach the chord's harmonic structure, the use of scales, arpeggios. I know these are all musical terms, but these are our definitions. And chord changes and rhythms suited for the context and the tempo or the speed of the music. The other approach that's defined in that study that we went off of for our mini study here is a practice-based approach, which incorporates features described by jazz professionals as important to their informal environmental learning processes. So it's a little bit more social in nature. So such as oral skills or hearing obtained through listening, mentorship, and training with other jazz musicians. And so he based the practice-based approach in this Brumbach study off of a Prouty study from 2012 and the theory-based approach from Bash in 1983. And so middle school, high school, and college or university jazz ensemble directors are not always consistent in their approach with these two teaching approaches to teaching improvisation based on a study we looked through in the literature. And so we found that comparisons of these teaching approaches among these varying age groups, we interviewed a middle school, high school, and university level instrumental jazz ensemble director. And so, and the reason we did this is because the comparisons of these teaching approaches among those varying age and experience levels haven't been widely researched with what we found. And so given that jazz bands typically start around junior high / middle school, we decided to have a middle school, high school, and a collegiate director. So what we did for our methods was to do a comparative case study among these three music educators. Each had at least 5 years of jazz ensemble teaching experience. We were thinking of who to recruit for this, and we wanted to kind of have some kind of rationale as to why they had the experience that they did. And so we found a study by Berliner from 1986 that was used recently in a different dissertation that we were looking at as well, that talked about the experience level specifically in teachers, and that a lot of times, not all the time, but music teachers in general, and in the case of this dissertation I'm referring to, music educators can go from a novice level teacher to more of an expert level teacher within 5 years. That's not always the case. Obviously, teachers teach for a very long time, and the society changes and technology changes, and a lot of things change within our profession. But we wanted to make sure that each of the three directors had at least 5 years of jazz ensemble teaching experience, not just music teaching experience, but teaching in a jazz setting. So we did we did 2 phone questionnaires. We did 1 Zoom questionnaire conducted for each participant. And we took the responses, transcribed, and coded them. So our research questions that went along with this were: what perceptions do instrumental jazz ensemble or IJE directors have about their own teaching approaches? The second one was, how do these directors decide which teaching approaches or approaches to implement with their student musicians? And number three, what are the differences in teaching approaches among a middle school, high school, and university IJE director? And so we found that the findings showed, which Heine will talk about in just a second here, the findings showed differences in complexities of the teaching approaches that came up within the responses that we got, but the similarities were in the approaches towards specifically rhythm, teaching rhythm to their students, depending on the age group that they were working with. So I'll hand it over to Heine to talk a little bit about the findings and the discussion.
Okay, so about the findings, we took those codings and trying to find those common themes between those three directors. We found that a few themes were common from those three teachers. So the listening aspect was something extremely important in all of those three interviews, but they were different in the complexity that they were talking about with the students. And the listening aspect was related to the use of the recordings throughout the teaching improvisation and the exposure to the various genres of jazz, or the various styles in jazz. And the contrasting aspect of those themes was the complexity. So for example, the middle school would talk about the use of the recordings as a reference, but using elements such as how the students feel about the elements that they're listening. And as a contrast of that, the university professor, he would talk about more complex elements related to the notes that they were using, the type of phrasing that they're using, and the articulation and other aspects more complex than that. The rhythm category, also we have something similar between those three elements, but differing a little bit on the complexity that they would use. For example, the rhythm as a vocabulary to express the style that they were playing, not just inside jazz specifically, but the other styles correlated to the environment of improvisation. And the use of articulation to express the feeling of the swing, because in jazz, something that is extremely important to the language of the style is how to swing, how to make you sound like a jazz musician, or as a reference to the recordings as well. So the key center is something more connected with the technical elements. So how they're gonna use scales and the overall harmonic structure. And they also differ between those three directors in terms of complexity that they were used. Also, something that we found was the feedback and the assessment between those three directors. The middle school, he would use the assessment, the peer feedback in a different way than the university director you'd use, the peer feedback. And also he talked about how he used the self-assessment, how they shouldn't see himself inside the ensemble, and how he evaluates himself and his improvisation technique. So also another theme is opportunity and community. All the three directors, they talked about how important it is, the jazz ensemble, for them to create an opportunity for them to express themselves, not just through the improvisation, but throughout the community that is created in the environment of the jazz ensemble. So the middle school director required every student musician to solo at least once in a performance. The high school director required every student musician to solo every week during rehearsals. And the university director didn't require them to improvise, but he encouraged them to participate in the improvisation aspect. The goals and approaches. improvisation. Okay. Improvisation is innate to everybody. All the three directors, they have this in common, that they were talking about, that improvisation is innate to all the, the participants. We also talked about the resources that they used to teach improvisation and how this impacted their approaches in teaching. All of them talked about books and recordings, and also differing the complexity that they use the elements on those books. For example, the university director, he had a different approach, thinking that the recordings were the best books to teach improvisation. Technique and technical aspects also related to scales and chord progressions and harmonic structures, rhythm and articulations. The university director, he encouraged a lot playing by ear and relying a lot in memorization. And we had also a different theme related to other other aspects, not just related to what I just said, but it was common from them that they use the jazz as a language, and this impacts a lot in the approach that they have teaching jazz improvisation. So going through the discussions and the conclusions, and not comparing, but pointing out to those two different approaches that we described, that Chan described to you regarding the practice-based and the theory-based approach, we found out that some of the middle school director, he had a blended approach to teaching improvisation. He utilized both theory-based and practice-based approach. He did this in a way that exposed students to genres, gave them access to recordings, allowed them to understand the experience of their fellow students, musicians, let them pay attention to their peers' improvisational skills, and solicited feedback to them with student assistance. The high school director had a theory-based approach to teaching improvisation. He focused on scales, chord progressions, and styles that are more accessible to students. This was a way to make students more comfortable playing the basic elements of jazz. And the university director blended both styles of improvisational teaching and gave more attention to the practice-based approach by creating a community of musicians connecting students to one another. He talks about how effective listening to recordings is for improvisation, and is keen on musical form allows students to be creative. Something that was extremely interesting about this is that, especially the university director, he pointed out that other elements can also impact the teaching approach of those directors, not just maybe just personal choice, but also elements really related to funds. For example, at the university level, they can have more funds to have spaces for classes just specifically about improvisation and history of jazz. And at the same time, the teachers in high school or middle school, they don't have the same opportunity to have the space just dedicated to improvisation for those groups. So this is something that maybe in future research we could go in depth about other aspects related to what can affect the teaching approach of those professors, teachers.
I'll just finish with one other point too. I think it's, not to use a music pun here, but noteworthy. I think it's noteworthy to say that, improvisation in itself in any form of music is very ambiguous. And so it's made up on the spot. And so we were kind of just looking a little deeper within this mini study to figure out, how do you teach students to be creative and make things up when they don't know they may not necessarily know where to start, especially in the middle school setting, where many student musicians who start in jazz band in middle school are usually not as exposed to the genres within jazz bands as high schools and college. And how do you sort of use those teaching approaches to build on one another as they get older and older. So it was really interesting to see the approaches that the three directors used, the commonalities and the contrasting themes between the three of them. So that was our study.
Well done, everyone. Thank you. Okay, so we have 5 presentations left, right?
Yep, we've done 6 and we have 5 left.
Okay, let's take a short break right now, like 3 minutes, and come back. And then we'll have less than 1 hour. Folks, remember that as you're presenting, we'll have less than 1 hour to get through 5. Okay. So, be parsimonious, I guess is the word, in terms of your presentation. So get up, get a drink, stretch, and come back in 3 minutes, please.
And we'll go on to Onyechi.
Yes. So, welcome, and my title is, my research question actually is, what are African and Middle Eastern master's or doctoral students' perceptions of the 5 A's, and that's affordability, accessibility, availability, accommodation, and acceptability of healthcare access at the University of Iowa Student Health Services? So my focus is about access. And so I thought that since this project was supposed to be education related, this was, University of Iowa Student Health will be a great place to get information about access to healthcare. And I'm also interested in vulnerable populations. So I know that people that are minority groups, based on studies, are known to have, experience disparities in healthcare access. So I just chose this population because I just thought, a couple of African students that I know, and I know that they use University of Iowa Student Health frequently. And yes, and so I was looking for a purposive sample of people that actually utilize services at UI Student Health. And there were people that had gone there at least once in the last 3 years. So by way of introduction, international students accounted for 5.5% of all US total higher education students were enrolled in 2019. It's a significant population, and these people, or international students, generally face a lot of challenges, associated with acculturation. They have to, first of all, there's a culture shock. They have to deal with social isolation. Lots of, people complain of loneliness. They deal with sometimes financial problems, and some of them actually deal with racial issues too. So it's a lot going on for international students. So I think that it's not that I think it's actually compounded, by the fact that healthcare access is a problem for this group. So there are 2 things that I found out. First of all, international students are described as a vulnerable population. So I was like, wow, okay, what makes them vulnerable? And the first thing I found in literature was the fact that all these acculturation issues, leave them, just hanging there, more or less like at the mercy of this or that. Sometimes they're exploited, taken advantage of, or just leave them in a poor state of mind generally, and they begin to develop health problems. Some of them mental health, some of them physical health, somatic issues, and then they're also vulnerable in the process by which they access healthcare. So they deal with cultural and language issues as well. So the first vulnerability is all the acculturation issues, and then the second vulnerability is, how they access healthcare. So I was interested in graduate students, that were of African or Middle Eastern ancestry, and just wanted to know what their experience of healthcare access at University of Iowa Student Health was. So I interviewed 3 people, and I conducted the interview over Zoom. Sorry for this. Conducted the interviews over Zoom after getting informed consent forms, signed informed consent forms from them. And the interviews were 45 minutes guided by protocol. And I asked them questions. All my questions were centered around this framework of access, as I call it. This framework of, like I mentioned, all accessibility and all of that. So my findings, what did I find out? So they were very interesting, I tell you. When I started doing this research, I didn't know I was going to enjoy it this much, I worried about doing a research by myself, a study by myself, but at the end of the day, I was glad that I did it. It was tough, but it was worth it. And so some of the questions I asked about availability of health, availability as a framework or as a dimension, I would say, of access. Some of the responses I got, the themes generated from those responses are what I have here in my findings. So for availability of healthcare resources, really that has to do with how are you able to, see a provider? Is it easy for you to see a provider when you want to? And it's interesting. I did this breakdown. Like I said, this framework helped me to, kind of structure my findings. So every response I got, I put it I aligned it to the dimension of access that it matched to. So for availability, the theme I found there was scheduling issues. Remember, availability is your ability to see the provider, right? So one of the negative themes, because I have like negative, positive for every dimension. So one of the negative themes was this. Listen, like they don't understand your accent. And so sometimes it's hard to schedule because it's just that if you meet that wrong person on the phone that is not just that is going to not hear you, or sometimes I have to hang up and call again. Remember, these are students trying to access healthcare. So essentially this person's accent is limiting their access. Now look at what somebody who gave a positive feedback said, or positive comment. So there are always options, and they let you know that you could actually see who you want to see if you're willing to wait a while. See differences in perceptions to different, by different respondents. Then ask about accessibility, and accessibility is, how far is it from your house? Is it easy to get to? And the general response was easy. I mean, this was the only dimension of access that was positive across board. It's right beside my college, right? It's actually pretty accessible. So as far as accessibility was like 100% positive. Then accommodation is really like, how is the healthcare how is healthcare organized and delivered? I focus more on the delivery, and in the delivery, I wanted to know, is your provider attentive? Do they take time to actually listen to you, to hear you out? Do you sense some kind of cultural awareness when you interact with your provider? And then the negative comment was, I don't appreciate when people ask me those questions, like, are you going to go back to your country, or just, it seems pretty innocuous, but to me, it's a way of what are you doing here? You don't belong here kind of thing. And for the positive feedback, it was, and so for me, it's very different to see somebody who celebrates something that's not her culture, and not in a patronizing way, and not in a condescending way, but in a way of, oh my God, this is so cool. Now for affordability, it was a mixed bag with trust, just a mixed bag. The negative comment was, I have learned to not trust my provider if they tell me, maybe you should do this one or this one. The first thing I'll ask them is, do you know the cost? And the person with the positive feedback, so having that trust that, everything that your doctor tells you is what is best for you overall. I don't have to remind my doctor that I'm a grad student. She knows, and she's factored all of that in. And finally, acceptability has to do with sex, gender, race, do they factor in your choice of a provider? And the positive response was, actually, there wasn't anything negative here. It was more neutral and positive. It was for the positive response. There's always been a woman physician for me. So whenever I go to look for a physician, I'm just always looking for a woman. And the neutral response was, I've never judged someone by their age or race or sex, as long as I go in sick and come out with a solution, which makes sense. So, I was curious about this person that was just always giving me positive feedback. And I wanted to dig deeper. I wanted to find out there was something, that was just so different about her own situation. And that's what I put in this discussion area. What is unique about that student who had consistently positive experiences? One, I found out trust that was built over time. That one who said, whatever they tell you, whatever the doctor tells her, she trusts that, they have her best interest, they know she's a grad student and all of that. The trust that the person told me that she had that same doctor for 4 years. No, actually, she's in her picture for the whole of her, doctoral journey, for the whole of 4.5 years. She had that same provider and it had never changed. And the other people I spoke with, they talked about random assignment of providers. Today you meet somebody, tomorrow you meet another. And, if you want, if you have a female, you're looking for a female doctor, maybe for some gynecological concerns, you don't have that luxury, it's difficult for them. So trust built over time was something about this unique respondent. And the other one was a provider's cultural background, because she was this respondent was very, was willing to talk about her provider a lot. She told me the provider is Mexican, married to an Indian, and told me that the provider's nurse, when I say provider, and I mean like the physician, and the nurse that works for that physician or works with that physician is Ethiopian. So she kept saying, oh, the Ethiopian gets it. I mean, my physician gets it. They get that financial thing. Like, I don't have to explain, they just get it. That's what she kept saying. And then I found this open-mindedness. She said, the physician would ask about her culture, ask about, things, and ask just out of curiosity, not because, I'm better than you or, you guys, just to know, and that would make her, that always made her very, free and comfortable and willing to share. And then the provider exhibited an understanding of her financial situation. She told me, I think in all her 5 years of grad school, the provider had only prescribed medications like twice or thrice, or 3 times. And it was, first of all, well, she's generally in good health, but the provider, and even when she gets supplements and things like that, the provider will tell her, you don't need all of those, you don't have to do this, so basically just always looking out for her and not wanting to just prescribe unnecessarily. Another thing was timeliness. A number of them did say that, well, one other person did say she would wait a long time before being seen, but this person her longest wait time ever was 15 minutes, so timeliness, and it just got me thinking. And that's what I put in the implication section. And does the ethnicity of a provider influence his or her understanding of the financial situation of minoritized students? And then the overarching theme is the lack of patient-centered care. Because I mean, if your physician doesn't care about how much you're spending, if they don't care about whether you can schedule appointments, or I won't say physician, I'll just say generally the healthcare system. If the people that are supposed to be scheduling are not patient enough to hear people out, if they're not people that are understanding of the fact that people have different accents, then that's the problem. That's not patient-centered care. People should not have access because they have an accent. It doesn't make sense. So what effort is this, like the health, UI Student Health, making to ensure that the people that we put at the front end, to get like people into the system, what effort are they making to ensure that they are trained, in cultural sensitivity? So that was what I found that there was a general theme here. It was the fact that the patient care was not patient-centered. It was a case of, however you feel is your business. Nobody's really taking the time to hear people out. Nobody's really taking the time to be culturally sensitive, or even understanding of people's financial situation. So these are things, international students are a unique group. They're a unique group. I don't think even every international student is different. An international student from New Zealand is different from an international student from Nigeria. So putting all international students in one category isn't even going to do it. But making the effort to really understand the needs and peculiarities of international students and relating to them in a way that makes them feel like they can actually access healthcare, because many of them feel like there's no point, there's no stress, I'll just self-medicate, it's just a hassle, and that really shouldn't be the case. So this was what I found out in my studies. I ended up really liking this topic. There might be room, for just further studies. I know it's not obviously generalizable because they were all females, first of all. And it was just African and Middle Eastern. I didn't interview anybody from China, which also has a very large population on campus. So, I mean, there's just a lot of things that make this study not generalizable, but just knowing that these are things that stand out among some international students, I think it is interesting. And then one other thing that I'll say is, somebody recommended at international student orientations, they just gloss over, because I've attended one, they just really gloss over healthcare, like UI student health. Someone comes and talks for a few minutes. They don't really go in depth to talk about healthcare insurance and what it all entails, and how it's just really glossed over. And it was clear from my interviews that a lot of the respondents had issues with understanding healthcare insurance and understanding what was covered and what was not covered. So that's room for some kind of, that's an educational opportunity for UI student health, as well as ISSS, international students and scholar services, to come together and really do a better job of orientating international students into what the US healthcare system is all about. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Hey, can you see my screen? If so, please thumbs up. All right, thank you. Oh, wait, sorry.
Yeah, I think BLB and I are supposed to be going now.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Onyechi. And I think I was muted. My bad. Yeah, we're gonna move on to BLB and Tiffany.
Oh, sorry, I was confused.
No worries.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Tiffany. So our team members are Tiffany, Simon, and BLB on. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So we are the second year doctoral students in the counselor education program. As our final research project, we intended to examine professional development of faculty members in the counselor education program. And we also wanted to provide recommendations for future counselor educators. Briefly speaking of the counseling field, the importance of professional development of counselor educators has increased as the necessity of counseling and appropriate interventions has increased in our society. Using semi-structured interviews, we asked the interviewees about their professional development experiences in the counselor education and supervision programs. Our results were expected to show challenges and potential resources for future CES faculty, as well as recommendations for doctoral students. So with this aim, we specified 2 research questions as follows. The first one is, what are the experiences of faculty members in the counselor education and supervision programs in terms of teaching, research, and leadership? And the second one is that how was the professional development of faculty members in the CS programs during their doctoral study? We investigated relevant literature on professional development of counselor educators. Well-known professional counseling organizations commonly highlighted the importance of supporting the career development of CS doctoral students. So considering the professional identity of counselor educators, they are usually under multiple duties, including teaching, research, supervision, advocacy, and leadership. So without enough support for developing counseling competencies, so they are vulnerable to negative outcomes such as burnout. Moreover, given the possible harmful effects that less qualified and prepared counselors can have on their clients, the CS programs are required to promote essential competencies of future counselor educators for effectively conducting their responsibilities and to prevent negative job-related outcomes. Therefore, given that collecting qualitative data from in-service professionals is helpful to understand counselor educators' unique work experiences and get practical insights, we designed this study. Speaking of the methods, we recruited 3 participants who are currently working as a faculty member in counselor education programs. After receiving consent forms and conducting semi-structured interviews, we transcribed the interviews and completed member checking. Then we analyzed data based on the principles of grounded theory. Specifically, we read the responses line by line and coded them according to the participants' own words, conducted additional open coding with the concepts derived from the existing counseling literature, and incorporated the codes into larger themes. So now Tiffany will explain the remaining parts.
The results of this study indicated that counselor educators share similarities in terms of job demands, process of professional development, and recommendations for doctoral students in CS programs. So some of the information that we got from our participants was, when talking about like the everyday experience as a counselor educator, one likened it to an average day in counselor education is like trying to herd cats at a circus. There's constantly a lot of moving pieces. And some of those pieces, as BLB shared, include teaching, publishing, advising, and engaging in community service. One participant advised that if we take our time to reflect on our experiences throughout the doc program, in addition to what we learn in class, none of what we learn will be wasted. That's what they shared when asked what was the most valuable part of their training. When we discussed the climate of the workplace for minority identities, this is gaining national attention currently, and the interviews shared their experience with traversing these climates. One shared that as a Black faculty member, I feel like there are always aspects of the climate that are far less than desirable. Colleges are still in many ways an old boys club. Whether this is right or not, I just know I have to work on leaving my work at work. I am sure that there are steps I could take to change the climate, but it boils down to what is it going to cost me to do so. And another faculty member shared that as a woman in this climate, I try to chip away at the glass ceiling. While it's definitely not fair, I just know I have to work harder and longer than some of my white male colleagues. But also I keep perspective that there are others who have to work twice as hard as me. And then we asked questions around what the job market is like in higher education, and they offered these insights. One suggested going to conferences because it's a pretty small field and people talk, and a lot of unofficial business happens while you're at these conferences. Another participant warned to remember from the moment you are with someone from the school, you are being interviewed, and also make sure to ask the same question to multiple stakeholders. It will give you a much more robust perspective of the school. And then when it comes to suggestions for future counselor educators, interviewees commonly denoted the importance of putting yourself out there. One stated also, I don't have to think that I'm worse than anyone else just because I failed. I think it's important to just give it a try. And another shared to not be afraid to fail. Submit that IRB that no one else believes in yet. You might just carve a new avenue in our field. So that was just some of the quotes that we really liked that we learned from our participants during this mini study. As far as our discussion goes, results of this study indicated specific areas consisting of the professional identity of a counselor educator, Among the duties of counselor educators, teaching was considered as the most challenging part for junior faculty members. However, they developed their own effective teaching methods and techniques in facilitating students' active participation. And in terms of the job search process, interviewees emphasized to clarify their career goals and apply appropriate CS programs having a good fit with the applicant. We found two major implications from our study. CES doctoral students can understand how their career would be like and prepare themselves for future challenges while considering the level of their professional identity development. And also, counselor education programs can develop curriculums and courses that help students develop their competency as counselor educators and promote job search process. And I think that is everything for us. And I don't know how to stop sharing my screen. Sorry. There we go.
Sorry, Bilby and Tiffany again that I confused the order. So I believe this is like my turn, right? So today, our presentation is the lived experience of Asian international students in synchronous online learning. Everyone can hear me and able to see the presentation? Yes, thank you.
So I will explain the first part of our presentation. So the title is The Lived Experience of Asian International Students in Synchronous Online Learning. So as an introduction, we all know that the outbreak of the COVID-19 made a rapid transition to online mode of teaching and learning. And literature said that online learning has pros and cons. So mostly high accessibility and convenience and efficiency are told as advantage of online learning. Or maybe on the other hand, the technology issue or technology competency could hinder the quality of the learning. And some study also reported that students tended to show low engagement in online classes. And other study also told that number of international students has increased, and international students have unique features and difficulty, such as language barrier, acculturation issues, or social isolation in white dominant higher education institution. So our basic idea is that the combination of feature of online class and international students' unique feature or difficulty could affect the quality of learning or class participation or communication of international students in online classes. So we interviewed 3 Asian international students as a inclusion criteria. Each of them has F1 visa, which means they are not a U.S. citizen, and each of them also a non-native English speaker, and currently lived in the U.S. and have both experience of face-to-face class before the pandemic and having synchronous class during the pandemic. And 2 of them were male, and 1 of them was female, and their age ranges from 28 to 33, and 1 of them was married. So we used we developed and used a semi-structured interview, and the interview questions were mostly about their experiences and perception of online class, and what is their difficulty and how their difficulty affect their class participation, their quality of learning. Also, maybe some differences between before and during the pandemic in online classes. So we used interpretative phenomenological analysis. So this analytic method mainly focused on what the participants have experienced in online class and how they interpret the experience. So to ensure trustworthiness, we did reflective journaling to identify our bias or prejudice, and also we did a pilot interview to refine interview question and decide order of the question. And also, as an investigative triangulation, we both individually did coding and compared the result after finishing the coding. And we also, one of the other doctoral student reviewed our results. So that's my point.
Yeah. Now I'm gonna talk about our finding and discussion part. So I know everybody is like very tired at this point, but I think this part will be the interesting part. So we pull up the 5 themes: the change in interaction, time efficiency, lack of motivation, difficulty in communication, and isolation. I also learned that it is really easy to scan the QR code to access the like PDF file. You don't really need QR coder. So you just need to pull up your phone and just like get close. It's gonna lead to the file, which is this one. So I will be really appreciate if you guys able to take a chance to look into this file, because I put a lot of effort to create and design this form. Let me explain about like our finding. Nature of interaction has been changing after COVID-19. International students feel interaction become more formal and less casual. They feel extra barrier to attend office hour or build personal relationship in synchronous online learning. International students also report they feel extra pressure to provide worthy of time when they ask questions or make a comment during the synchronous online class. International students are generally positive about online learning, that they can control over the time easily on the online class mode, but they also feel assignment and team project become more effective because like all the work become individualized. And then they also report not surprisingly, they report they experience a lack of motivation in general and distracted when they especially turn off the video and when they're able to stay invisible in the big size class. And difficulty in communication, it means international students perceive additional language barrier in online class due to a poor sound quality and internet disconnections and lack of non-verbal cues. The last theme that we found is international students experience feeling of isolations and frustration with the lack of casual social interactions and connection in and outside of the class. So our discussion is international students report generally positive attitude towards synchronized online class. I was a little bit surprised by this result. And positive on transitioning from face-to-face class to online class in terms of quality of learning. But they also report lack of motivation and distraction and isolation. And there is a few limitations in our study because there is no literature about online learning under COVID-19 situation. It is difficult to abstract unique experience of international students in relate to experience other students' population. This experience, it's hard to say this is a unique experience for international student, or it could be shared experience of every student in this period. And our participants experience synchronous online class differently based on their major due to different teaching and communication styles. It will be interesting to conduct further research to examine the effect of chosen major on international student experience with the synchronous online classes. And one participant responded a great deal of frustration and doubt about staying in the US to continue their online class. It kind of makes sense that people have to stay in US, and even though there's a no casual interaction and personal interaction beyond the screen. And further studies should be considered about contextual factors such as duration of their stay in the US and remaining year before then going back to their home country, and marriage status and social support around them. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And now we're going to move on to Alex, Jackie, Kara, and Terry.
Okay, I can see the screen, so I'm going to assume everyone else can see the screen. We'll try to be fast, super speedy speed round. So our research was looking at how being newly married impacts identity. And this study aimed to explore how being newly married impacts one's personal roles and, you know, kind of how you might feel differently once you transition from engagement to marriage. So background in literature review, the importance of this study is highlighted through the gaps in the previous literature. And most of the research is outdated, so 20 plus years is when the data was last collected, primarily examined through a quantitative lens. So we wanted to also get a qualitative lens on that, and focused, a lot of the marital literature focuses on more established marriages, which are 6+ years. How our study fills the gaps in the literature, we collected new qualitative data to explore the newlywed experience with a historical event of COVID, and perspective of a newer, younger generation that might have changed rules on dating, engagement, and marriage.
All right, so our theoretical model, so we used the communication theory of identity to really ground our work that we did. And so it has sort of 5 different roles or 5 different types of our identities. So we've got personal, which is your personal self-concept, your sense of who you are. You have your enacted, so that's your behaviors and how your behaviors kind of enact, again, who you are. Relational is identities that emerge from a relationship. And then communal, that identities that emerge out of groups or networks. And so this theory really also talks about how when there is tension or uncertainty or conflict within those 4 identities, that causes an identity gap. For our method and our sample, we used semi-structured qualitative interviews, and we did a sort of basic qualitative study. They were conducted via Zoom, and they were recorded, transcribed verbatim, coded, double coded, and then analyzed for research and for themes and sub-themes. And as you can see, we've got some basic information there about what the mean age of our sample is at marriage, the differences between the age of spouses. So there was one couple that had a very sort of large age difference. You can see that in the range. And then we had a sample of 4 female participants for our interviews.
All right, so findings and themes. You guys can read, so I'm just going to give you the abridged version here. Not unsurprisingly, marriage tends to shift the roles that we play in all realms of our lives. And what we found in the research is that the career role you had pre-marriage was really the top competition for time and attention, both through dating, engagement, marriage, and so on. And so when we have those personal and interpersonal gaps, that tends to lead to a little tension in the marriage. As you can see there, our participants said her other roles have stepped up while who she would consider to be herself has kind of stepped back. You also experience communal tension, especially when you use or reject the script that we've been fed about marriage. So a lot of those norms are, you get engaged, you don't live together, you get married, you move in, you shit out your first puppy, and that's all good and well. But however, some of our couples didn't do that or don't plan on doing that, and so they experience a little pushback there. as you can see from our quote. So I'm going to turn it over to Kara now for the final part of the presentation.
Thank you. So during those contentious times in the identity gap, communication was absolutely key. Across the board through all of our couples, or all of our respondents, we saw that they had very open communication styles. And we sort of believe this is because they all had really long friendships and courting periods first, and they established really open, strong communication styles before they were even married. So they intentionally talk about and address when time and energy is being pulled between new roles. So you can see the quote. So we've always talked about, we've always had open communication. We've always gone to each other for everything. So that was absolutely key and really points right back to the theoretical model. So our discussion and implications. So we've told you there are these identity gaps. They can be harmful to relationships. They can have negative outcomes, but these are decreased when you have open communication. It increases satisfaction in the relationship. And this sample happened to be a bunch of millennial females. And so we found that they were really navigating the societal script differently, and good for them. They were picking and choosing what they wanted to use based on what their families were impressing upon them and society as a whole. So future research, if someone wanted to continue this, we nowhere near saturated the data. We had 4, they were all females, they were all in their 20s. There was some diversity in our sample, but really we need a larger, more diversified sample.
All right. And I think Andrea, Chelsea, Hannah, and Leah can round us out here.
Yeah, I'll get us started. Hey, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there with us. We promise to also be mindful of the time. So obviously, I'm Chelsea, and I'm a counseling psych student. The other 3 students who will introduce themselves as they go, I'm sure, are chemistry students. And so a few of us had taken class together in the past prior to this semester. And so we knew we wanted to work together, but we weren't sure how to combine all of our discipline interests to formulate into a project. So we decided to choose imposter syndrome because we felt like it tied in the psychological component of what it feels like to be in a STEM related field. And so what I'll do is start by giving a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it off. Many of you might be familiar with the term imposter syndrome. It's actually been around since the 1970s. And the definition describes a feeling of inadequacy despite evidence contradicting someone's emotional experience. And this typically happens when you're going through an academic program or a new job. Sorry, I ran down the stairs right before this and I'm out of breath. The experience of imposter syndrome often contains 3 main components. The first is fear of evaluation. The second is fear of being unable to repeat success as a result of luck. And the third component is a fear of being less capable than others and doubting the self. So what we see these fears combining as is it produces a feeling that the individual might be exposed or realized by others that they're undeserving to be in their present role. We found that this is specific to doctoral students in STEM fields, and the literature demonstrates that this population might be particularly vulnerable to the experience of imposter syndrome. We found the contextual factors of higher ed and the culture of academic departments to trigger some of these feelings. And then oftentimes a lack of diverse representation and then the inadvertent perpetuation of stereotypes within STEM for women and minority students also can trigger these feelings, which a lot of you have alluded to. So taken together, we wanted to do a study to consider how first and second year women in the University of Iowa chemistry PhD program navigated imposter syndrome and how that might be beneficial to advancing what is already out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. I'm Leah. I'm a PhD student in the chemistry department. And so for our study, we took a phenomenological approach. And basically what that means is we were really interested in trying to understand our participants' own lived experiences. And so with this framework, we were able to utilize that in a way that helped us to formulate very intentional interview questions. So we were able to use that framework to form our questions in a way that would allow us to really understand the experiences of these women in the STEM program. And so two methods that are kind of under the phenomenological umbrella are epique and horizontalization. And so with the epique, we were very intentional about reflecting on our own experiences before we gave our interviews. It's just a qualitative research technique that allows us to check our own biases, check our own experiences. So we were intentional to be able to go into our interviews with an open mind. And then another method that we used was horizontalization, which basically just says that we looked at all of our data equally. So we held all of our transcripts, all of our interviews to an equal standard. We went through and coded each transcript with equal eyes. And we were able to use open coding, as most of us did, and axial coding to figure out some results and themes.
Thank you, Leah. Okay, hello everyone, I'm Hannah. I'm also a PhD student in the chemistry department, and I'm going to be going over the results of our findings. So we had three major themes that came about from our coding. The first one being, despite high achieving students who work really hard in graduate school and to get to graduate school, they still have these feelings of self-doubt, and they're encountering quite a bit. We also had another theme of they acknowledge imposter syndrome and that it's critical for individuals to feel supported. However, acknowledging it is not enough to eliminate it and eliminate these feelings of inadequacy. The third thing we found was that systematic pressures beyond the department and the cohorts resulted in feelings of feeling less than their peers, despite evidence that of the individual's success. And a major component of this has been compounded by the isolation during our current pandemic. A lot of these the students or participants we looked at did say that being in a Zoom space all the time and not really interacting with each other was affecting their self-doubt quite a bit. And we also made a word bubble here with the most common phrases that we had, and the major one being self-doubt, feeling like a fraud and really struggling here in chemistry. I also wanted to point out that these 4 participants here, these are their quotes they used once they were asked if they could define imposter syndrome. And we see that all of these quotes really do well align with what the actual definition of imposter syndrome that we had found they matched.
Hey everyone, I'm Andrea. I'm also in the chemistry department. And so I'm going to talk about the implications. And so we see that there's a lot of implications for our study. We all have experienced imposter syndrome at some point, and it's something that definitely plagues us as grad students. And so we feel like it's really important for institutions, in our case, chemistry departments, not just here at Iowa, but at other places across the nation, to really pay attention to the fact that students have these feelings. And so from our data, we kind of had 2 major themes when it comes to implications. The first was that imposter syndrome really needs to be talked about. A lot of our participants referenced being able to share these feelings with friends or family members, even if they didn't fully understand that. Just talking about it really gave them a little bit of a relief. And then the second thing is providing a supportive environment in order to talk about these feelings. And so many of our participants talked about how they chose their specific research groups or this department because they felt safe and they felt like they were in a supportive environment. And so these would be the 2 things that we would encourage departments and people within those departments to really think about. And so if you guys are interested, we think that our participants, the way that they described advice that they would give to other people, as well as things that departments could do better, we thought they described it best. And so you can use these QR codes to see their quotes. But other than that, we thank you guys for listening to us, and we would welcome any questions you have.
Yay, that was fun. Okay, Gordon, can we pause this recording or stop this recording and come up with another one?
Yep, sounds good. Okay. Thanks for tuning in for anyone that's watching this.
Yeah, thank you.